Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the really intricate and honestly often surprising world of honeybees. You've shared a fantastic set of articles and research with us, so we're going to dig into their life history, their ecology, and how they actually build and live in their nests. Our goal here is basically to pull out the most important insights, those real aha moments from these sources. We want to give you a really well-informed look at how honeybee colonies live and survive way beyond just, making honey.
Yeah, this isn't just typical beekeeping stuff. We're looking at the wild side, their strategies for survival, how they interact with the world.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We've got some genuinely interesting material covering, well, everything from their annual cycle to the nitty-gritty of building and defending their homes.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how interconnected it all is. You see how these different parts of their life, they reveal strategies that are quite unique in the insect world.
It really does. And the sources, like that Seeley and Vischer study you mentioned, they paint such a vivid picture of the colony's year. It turns out it's not just one long buzz of activity.
No, not at all. Most of their food collection, their nectar gathering, it happens in these really short, intense bursts, these nectar flows.
So for a lot of the year, they're actually losing weight, just living off their stores.
Precisely. For much of the year, they're drawing down those reserves. And reproduction, things like swarming, that's timed very carefully, usually late spring, right when brood rearing peaks and there's plenty of food around.
Ah, okay. And having lots of sealed brood when they swarm must be crucial then.
Absolutely critical. It means the swarm leaves with a big chunk of the workforce, but the original colony can recover fast because new adults are constantly emerging.
And winter. That sounds like the real bottleneck. They hit their lowest population right before they start raising brood again, maybe January, February.
That's right. And that's the most costly part. Energetically, they have to heat that brood area, the nursery, to at least 32 degrees Celsius.
32 degrees. That's way warmer than the 10 degrees or so the adult bees can handle.
Exactly. So starvation is a huge risk then. The energy demand is just immense.
Yeah.
But interestingly, tackling this challenge also gives them a massive advantage.
How so?
Well, by starting brood rearing in the dead of winter, when other social insects, like say bumblebees, are basically dormant, honeybees get this huge head start on the season.
Right, so they can build up their numbers much earlier.
Much earlier. They can hit peak colony size way before their competitors.
So yeah, definitely not a steady buzz all year. It's more like intense sprints and then these tough survival phases.
Exactly. And this whole annual cycle, it ties directly into something else. The sources really highlight the honeybee's overall life strategy. They aren't really built like most other social insects.
How do you mean?
Well, the research talks about R-type versus K-type strategies. R strategies are typically about high reproduction, high mortality, populations boom and bust. Think of most insects, or even a queen bumblebee trying to start a colony alone. Huge failure rate.
Okay, lots of offspring, low survival chance.
Right. But honeybees, and maybe some swarm-founding wasps too, they reproduce differently. They split off as a whole unit, a swarm of thousands.
Ah, so the swarm itself is the reproductive unit.
Precisely. And while a new swarm still faces risks, its chance of surviving that first year is way, way higher than a lone queen's.
So this makes them K-type strategists. That seems really weird for an insect.
It does feel counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But according to Seeley's work back in the late 70s, they really fit the K-type mold.
Which means
Low mortality, but at the colony level.
a low reproductive rate established colonies might only swarm once or twice a year. Long colony lifespan, stable population numbers year after year, consistent reproduction.
Wow. And there was a figure mentioned.
Yeah, that study in a temperate forest found established colonies had something like a 78% annual survival rate. That is incredibly stable for an insect colony.
Okay, 78%. So why is knowing their K-type so important for understanding them? Because it changes how you think about their behavior. The colony operates like this long-term entity, this superorganism. A single forager bee isn't just thinking about her own short life. Her actions serve the needs of this stable, long-lived collective.
So that allows for more specialization, risk-taking.
Exactly. Individual bees can take on dangerous jobs foraging far away, defending the nest fiercely, because the colony itself, the K-selected unit, can easily absorb the loss of a few individuals. It's a fundamentally different setup than a solitary bee or even a temporary bumblebee colony.
Okay, that makes sense. So given they have this capacity for stability in large populations, How does that actually play out in the wild? What do their populations look like?
Right, that brings us to a really interesting point in the sources about honeybee populations, especially this question around wild bees. Their densities vary massively depending on where you look.
Yeah, the numbers were quite different. Low in Europe, like 2 to 5 colonies per square kilometer.
Yeah, in some areas. Then jump to South Africa, it's more like 12 to 17. And then you get to parts of Australia where European honeybees were introduced.
And it's way higher, like 70 to over 100 per square kilometer.
Insanely high densities. And that study in Australia by Oldroyd and his colleagues back in '97, it was really revealing about their population dynamics.
What did they find?
They found that even with those super high densities, a surprisingly low swarming rate, just zero point 0.7 swarms per colony per year, on average, was actually enough to maintain the population level.
Only 0.7, but don't they swarm more often than that?
They do. The actual rate was more like 2 or 3 swarms per year, which means they had this massive potential for population growth and incredibly fast recovery if numbers dropped.
And fast.
They measured a recovery rate of something like 10 colonies per square kilometer per year after they'd experimentally removed bees from an area, just bouncing right back.
That is remarkable resilience. And it really challenges that common idea, doesn't it? The one you hear especially in Europe and North America, that wild honeybees basically got wiped out.
It absolutely does. That narrative, often blaming Varroa mites or genetic mixing with managed bees introgression, seems to be based on, well, sometimes limited studies.
But newer research paints a different picture.
Yeah, the sources point to more recent, larger-scale work. Genomic studies in Europe, like that big one by Pinto and another in Ireland by Brown, are actually finding thriving wild populations in many places.
And genetically distinct ones, not just feral managed bees.
Exactly. With surprisingly little sign of recent mixing with managed stocks in many of these wild populations.
So the story about wild bees, it might be more hopeful than we thought. Their ability to bounce back is quite something.
It really is. It suggests maybe our focus shouldn't just be on trying to reestablish populations we assume are gone, but maybe more on protecting the healthy wild populations that are still out there from current threats.
That's a really important point. Okay, so we've looked inside the colony at their yearly cycle, their life strategy, their population strength. What about how they interact with, well, everyone else, especially other pollinators?
Right, because they're often competing for the same food, pollen, and nectar. There's been a lot of research, and frankly a lot of debate, about what happens when you introduce honeybees or increase beekeeping density in an area. How does it affect the native bees?
And that big review by Mallinger and colleagues, the results seemed kind of messy.
They were pretty mixed, yeah. When looking at direct competition for flowers or nest sites, it was almost 50-50. About half the studies found negative effects on other bees, the other half found no clear effect or variable results.
And similar for changing the plant communities.
Pretty much the same split, some positive effects, some negative, some none. It gets complicated.
But what about disease? That seemed clearer.
Much clearer, and unfortunately more consistently negative. Most studies looking at disease found that pathogens we associate with honeybees do show up in other pollinators, and often wild bees near apiaries had higher pathogen loads.
That's concerning. Although you mentioned a caveat.
Yeah, it's important to remember that a lot of studies rely on what we call fitness proxies. Like, they measure how often native bees visit flowers. Not necessarily whether the actual number of native bees goes up or down. Direct abundance data is harder to get.
Okay. But for some groups, like bumblebees, the negative impact seems more solid.
Yes. For bombus, bumblebees, the evidence for negative effects is stronger. Those studies by Thompson in California are a key example. He found bumblebee colony health and reproductive success went down when they were closer to honeybee apiaries.
And he saw bumblebee populations decline when honeybees recovered from Varroa.
Exactly. A pretty clear competitive interaction there. Similar effects have been seen in Europe too, though it often depends on the specific habitat.
What about solitary bees? They're the vast majority of bee species.
The results there are more mixed again. Some studies, particularly with Africanized honeybees in Central America, found basically no negative impact on solitary bees over long periods. But other studies, say in Australia or parts of Europe, did find negative effects.
So the takeaway is, honeybees definitely compete, they clearly impact bumblebees negatively, and solitary bees. Sometimes. It depends.
That's a fair summary. It really seems context dependent. We need more research to understand when and why those negative impacts happen.
Okay, so that's competition between species. But what about competition within the honeybee species itself?
Ah, yes. Robbing. This is a behavior that, according to the sources, is actually quite important, but often gets overlooked. It's straight-up intraspecific competition, one colony stealing food stores from another.
And this happens mostly during certain times.
Yeah, it really ramps up during nectar dearths, those periods when there aren't many flowers blooming and natural food is scarce. We don't know exactly how much food colonies get through robbing, but it can be substantial.
And crucially, it spreads diseases, right? Like
Yeah.
Varroa mites.
Absolutely. Robbing is a major pathway for transmitting pests and pathogens between colonies. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. A colony weakened by disease might be less able to defend itself, making it a prime target for robbers.
So how does robbing actually work? What does it look like?
Well, first, colonies usually only post guards at the entrance when resources are scarce during those dearths. When nectar is flowing freely, there are often no guards.
Makes sense. Why waste the effort?
Right. And during dearths, scout bees aren't just searching for patches of flowers, they're also actively looking for other colonies. We don't actually know if they're the same scouts doing both jobs, interestingly.
Okay, so a scout finds another hive. What next?
When a potential robber approaches a target hive, she flies in this very distinctive zigzag pattern near the entrance.
A zigzag. Why?
Well, the guards definitely recognize it as suspicious. It often triggers an immediate defensive reaction, leading to fights. These fights are often lethal, but sometimes the robber manages to slip past the guards.
And there was that speculation. Could the zigzag be a way of testing the defenses?
Yeah, Johnson and Nia proposed that. Maybe the robber is probing if the guards react fast and hard, the colony's strong, maybe look elsewhere. If the reaction is slow or weak, maybe it's vulnerable.
Or maybe she's just unfamiliar with the entrance.
That's the other possibility. Yeah, it's not definitively known. But if a robber does get inside, she tanks up on honey, flies back to her own nest.
And tells her sisters. Using the waggle dance.
Presumably, yes. She likely performs a dance to recruit a massive robbing force from her own colony, although that specific recruitment for robbing hasn't been directly observed and documented in the same way as foraging dances.
And a full-scale robbing attack sounds brutal.
It is. Thousands of bees from the robbing colony attack the target hive. They fight and kill the defenders, especially the older guard bees. They completely strip the hive of all its honey stores. Often the young bees and the queen in the robbed colony are just left behind to starve. It's total destruction.
Wow. Is there much experimental work on this?
Surprisingly little, but some key findings. Butler and Free showed that the defensive response is inducible. If you keep introducing foreign bees to a hive entrance, the colony becomes hyper-aggressive, mauling almost any bee that tries to get in.
They learn to ramp up defense?
Exactly. And strangely, bees that get mauled, even if they're actual nestmates caught in the confusion, often don't fight back. Maybe to prevent accidental friendly fire, it's the robbers who are aggressively fighting. The bees from the colony being attacked often seem more passive once overwhelmed.
Fascinating. And this relates to that optimal acceptance threshold idea.
It does, yeah. The core idea is that the chemical cues bees use to recognize nestmates aren't perfectly unique. There's overlap between colonies. So a guard bee making a split-second decision faces a dilemma.
Let a stranger in by mistake or turn away one of your own.
Exactly. A false acceptance or a false rejection. The theory, developed by people like Lacey, Sherman, Getz, Smith, and Reeve, predicts that the best strategy, the optimal threshold, depends on the costs of each error.
So when there's lots of nectar.
The cost of letting a stranger sneak a bit of honey is low. So the threshold should be low, accept almost everyone, even if you make some false acceptances. Fewer guards needed, less energy spent fighting.
But during a dearth, when robbing is a threat.
The cost of a false acceptance is huge. It could lead to the whole colony being destroyed. So the threshold should be high. Be really kicky, only accept bees with strong, clear nestmate cues, even if it means you occasionally reject one of your own sisters by mistake, false rejection.
And experiments confirm this.
Beautifully. That work by Downs and Ratniks is a classic. During a nectar dearth, guards accepted about 80% of their actual nestmates, but only 2% of bees from other colonies. Very selective.
But during a nectar flow.
They accepted everyone, 100% of nestmates, and 100% of non-nestmates too. The threshold dropped right down, just as the theory predicted.
That's amazing. They can just flick that switch depending on the conditions.
Yeah, the speed of that change is really strong support for the model. It does make you wonder, though, what happens to those poor nestmates who get falsely rejected during a dearth? Probably not permanently excluded, but it's not entirely clear.
Okay, shifting gears from bees fighting bees to bees fighting bigger things. Vertebrates.
Right. Because a honeybee nest, packed with honey and nutritious larvae, is like a giant flashing neon sign saying all-you-can-eat buffet for animals like bears, badgers, skunks, even some birds.
So they need serious defense.
Absolutely. And European honeybees typically have an escalating defense. They often start with warnings bumping into the intruder, buzzing loudly right in their face.
Trying to scare them off first.
Exactly. If that doesn't work, then they sting. And stinging isn't just a one-off attack.
Because of the alarm pheromone.
Right. When a bee stings, the stinger stays in the victim, and attached to it are glands releasing alarm pheromones. This scent acts like a chemical flare, attracting other bees and marking the target, causing the attack to build exponentially. It becomes a coordinated assault.
And they aim for specific spots.
They do. Eyes, nose, mouth, the sensitive areas. This seems like a clear adaptation against furry predators, where stinging the main body might not be as effective. They'll actually crawl through fur to reach the skin.
And they don't give up easily.
Not at all. Even after a bee has stung and lost her stinger, which is fatal for her, she'll often continue to harass the intruder, buzzing around, bumping into them. They are incredibly persistent defenders.
Which brings us to that classic question. Why aren't beekeepers who are deliberately invading the nest stung constantly? Is it just because they've bred gentle bees?
Well, the sources suggest that's only a small part of the story. While there has been selection for calmer bees in beekeeping, any colony, even a supposedly gentle one, can become extremely defensive if provoked in the right way.
So it's not mainly the bee's temperament.
Not primarily. The key is that beekeepers have figured out, consciously or not, how to exploit gaps in the bee's natural defense system and how to disrupt their communication.
Okay, what are the main tricks?
3 main things. First, and most famously, smoke. Smoke disrupts their ability to smell those alarm pheromones. It essentially scrambles their communication lines, preventing that coordinated escalating attack.
Cuts off the signal. Makes sense.
Second, the use of removable frames. Think about how a bear would get honey in nature. It would have to rip apart the comb. That physical destruction, that vibration and tearing sound, is likely a massive trigger for an amplified defense response. Beekeepers lift frames out gently, avoiding that specific trigger.
Clever. And the third thing?
It's about where they enter the hive. Natural predators almost always attack the front entrance, right? That's where the oldest, most experienced bees, the guards, the foragers, are concentrated. They're primed for defense at that spot.
But beekeepers usually open the hive from the top or back.
Exactly. They're entering an area mostly occupied by younger, middle-aged bees whose jobs are things like processing nectar and tending brood, not guarding the entrance. There hasn't been the same evolutionary pressure to defend aggressively against threats coming from above or behind.
So they're kind of sneaking in the back door, avoiding the main security force.
Pretty much. And any beekeeper can tell you, the bees often get progressively more defensive the deeper you go into the hive, closer to the core brood area.
That really changes how you see a beekeeper working. It's less about having magically calm bees and more about cleverly bypassing their evolved defenses.
It absolutely is. And all this complex behavior, this survival, defense, competition, it all revolves around the nest. The nest is truly central, especially in temperate zones where they have to overwinter. So much of their evolution is tied to finding, building, and managing that home.
Where do they typically nest in the wild?
Tree hollows are the classic preferred site. But they're adaptable.
Mm.
The sources mentioned they'll use rock cavities, spaces under overhangs, sometimes even nesting out in the open on a branch, though that's less common and usually in warmer climates.
And the size of the cavity matters.
It does. The typical range for a wild nest is somewhere between 20 and 100 liters in volume, with the average being around 40 liters. That size can comfortably house a colony of maybe 40,000 bees at its peak, although the actual population fluctuates hugely through the year.
And inside that cavity, the comb isn't just randomly placed, is it?
No, there's a very standard, logical layout, which Seeley and Morse documented beautifully. Generally, the brood, the eggs, larvae, pupa, is reared in the lower central part of the combs. Honey is stored above the brood, towards the top and sides.
And pollen.
Pollen is usually stored in a band between the brood and the honey, or sometimes in cells scattered within the brood area itself, keeping it close to where the nurse bees need it to feed the larvae. And remember, that's a typical cross-section. The combs on the outer edges of the nest will have less brood and more honey storage.
And they build different types of cells for different purposes.
That's right. 3 main types. You have the standard worker cells, those perfect hexagons we all recognize. Then there are drone cells, which are noticeably larger hexagons, used for rearing male bees. And finally, queen cups, which look quite different. They're larger, peanut-shaped cells that hang vertically, usually built along the bottom edges of the comb, ready for rearing a new queen if needed.
And the honey storage cells are different too.
Yeah, the cells right at the top, used purely for capping honey, often tend to be a bit larger and less perfectly uniform than the brood cells below.
And I read something fascinating. The brood comb itself changes over time. It gets darker and the cells actually shrink.
Yes, that's a really interesting detail. With every generation of brood raised in a cell, the pupa spins a silk cocoon, and there are waste products left behind. These get incorporated into the cell wall by the bees when they clean it.
So layer upon layer builds up.
Exactly. This gradually darkens the comb, making old brood comb almost black, and it also slightly reduces the internal diameter of the cell over time, which means bees emerging from very old comb can actually be slightly smaller than those from brand new comb.
Wow, but honeycombs don't do that.
No, because they're only used for storing honey, not rearing brood. They stay much lighter in color and don't shrink.
Okay, so who actually builds all this intricate wax structure?
That's the job of a specific age group, or temporal caste, the middle-aged bees. These are bees that have graduated from being young nurse bees tending the larvae, but haven't yet transitioned to being older foragers flying outside the hive.
And they have special glands for this.
Yes, they activate wax glands located on the underside of their abdomen. These glands are underdeveloped in young bees and tend to atrophy in old foragers. It's a great example of temporal polytheism, how a bee's job changes systematically as she ages.
So how do they actually make the wax and build?
Well, first, they need to get warm. They often form these dense clusters or curtains of bees, raising the temperature in that area to around 40 degrees Celsius. That's the optimal temperature for wax secretion and manipulation.
40 degrees. Quite warm.
Very. Then these tiny translucent flakes of wax emerge from between the segments on their abdomen. They scrape these flakes off with their legs, chew them up, mixing them with saliva and maybe tiny amounts of propolis, making the wax pliable.
And then they sculpt it.
They sculpt it. Construction usually starts as a single strip hanging down, and then they rapidly draw it out into those amazing hexagonal cells. It seems to start from an initially circular cell shape that quickly transitions to the hexagon.
The hexagon shape is famous for its efficiency, right? Maximum storage, minimum wax.
Absolutely legendary. But how they achieve that perfect hexagonal geometry? Well, that's been debated for centuries.
What are the theories?
Oh, there have been many. Old ideas involve bees acting like tiny sculptors with built-in rulers. More recently, there was a fascinating physics-based model suggesting that if the bees just heated the wax close to its melting point, the surface tension and pressure from surrounding circular cells would automatically cause them to relax into hexagons self-organization.
Like soap bubbles forming hexagons.
Kind of, yeah. That was the PERC model from the early 2000s. But then later research by people like Bauer and Bienenfeld and Nazi actually measured the temperatures during construction and found they probably weren't high enough for that pure physics model to work alone.
So back to the bees actively building it.
It seems likely it's a combination, the physics helps, but the bees are actively shaping and guiding the process. The exact mechanism, how they achieve such precision without blueprints, is still something of a mystery.
And building combs must be expensive for the colony, energetically.
Incredibly expensive. The sources mention it takes something like 6 to 8 pounds of honey consumed to produce just 1 pound of wax. So they don't build it wastefully. Construction is very tightly regulated.
How do they regulate it? When do they decide to build more?
Pratt's work, highlighted in the sources, showed it's controlled by two things happening at the same time. First, the existing combs need to be sufficiently full, basically. They need the storage space. And second, there has to be a good nectar flow coming into the hive.
Both conditions needed to start.
Both needed to initiate building. Once they start, though, it seems only the continued nectar flow is required to keep them going.
And they also control what kind of comb they build, like worker versus drone cells.
Yes, they regulate that ratio too. There's that idea from Ulster and Wilson, comparing colonies to plants initially. They invest heavily in growth, building worker combs for more workers, and then later they shift to balancing growth with reproduction, building drone comb.
So they might wait until the colony is big enough before building drone cells.
That seems to be the case, yeah. Studies on swarms support this. They prioritize worker comb first. And Pratt did experiments showing this regulation directly.
What did he do?
He added drone comb to colonies, and they built less of it themselves. He removed drone comb, and they were triggered to build more. They're definitely measuring and responding.
How did they measure it, though?
That's the million-dollar question. The mechanism isn't fully known. But remember those middle-aged bees, the builders. They spend a lot of their time, maybe 20%, just patrolling the combs, inspecting cells, Johnson suggested this patrolling might be how they directly assess the colony's needs, how much brood, how much food, how much space, how many drones are needed.
Wow. Constant assessment and adjustment. Okay, one last building material, propolis. The bee glue.
Right. That sticky resin they collect from tree buds and sap flows,
What do they mainly use it for inside the nest?
primarily for sealing things up. In a natural tree cavity, they'll often strip away any soft, decaying wood and then coat the entire inner surface with a thin layer of propolis. They also use it to fill any cracks or holes, reducing drafts and improving thermoregulation. It makes the nest cavity weather-tight and defensible.
And it varies a lot, doesn't it, depending on the trees?
Hugely. It can be reddish, brown, black, yellow. Its consistency varies, and importantly, its antimicrobial properties change depending on the plant sources available in their area.
Antimicrobial, so it has health benefits.
That's where some really exciting recent research comes in, highlighted in the sources. Work by people like Borba and Spivak and Simone Finstrom's group has shown significant adaptive benefits.
How do they show that?
They set up hives where some colonies were encouraged to build a natural propolis envelope inside, mimicking what they do in a tree. We compared these to standard hives without that envelope.
And the difference was?
The bees in the propolis-rich hives had significantly lower activation levels of key immune system genes. You can measure the transcripts, like for the antimicrobial peptide hymenopterin, they were lower.
Meaning their immune systems weren't working as hard?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The propolis envelope itself was creating a more sanitary environment, reducing the overall pathogen load inside the nest. So the bees didn't need to constantly ramp up their individual immune defenses. It's like colony-level immunity, provided by the nest structure itself.
Who knew sticky tree resin could be such a powerful public health tool for a bee colony? Amazing. We have really covered a ton of ground here, haven't we? Pulled together some, I think, really fascinating insights from all these sources you shared. We've gone from that demanding yearly cycle and their unique K-type strategy for long-term survival to how their populations boom and bust, or don't bust as much as we thought.
To how they compete and interact with other bees, including that whole hidden world of robbing between colonies.
Right. And their smart defenses against big predators, and then all the incredible details of how they engineer their homes with wax and even use propolis as medicine. Hopefully digging into all this gives you a much richer, more informed view of what's actually going on inside and around a honeybee colony.
It definitely underscores how much complexity there is. Even in creatures we think are so familiar, there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it?
For sure. Like, what exactly is the step-by-step process they use to build that perfect comb? We still don't fully know. Or what really happens to those nest mates that get rejected by guards during a dearth? Where do they go?
And how can we better understand the nuances of their impact on other pollinators, figuring out when and where competition becomes a serious issue?
Yeah, so many questions still out there. What other hidden complexities, what other amazing systems and behaviors might be waiting to be discovered? Not just in honeybees, but in social insects generally.
Exactly. Definitely something fascinating to keep in mind as you go about your day.